Welcome back to Daytimers. We're in Philippians 4, and I think we'll finish the letter today.
Oh, good.
We've got kind of two good sections of discussion, and then sort of a paragraph about a financial gift from the church that he receives, and then a kind of final greeting. So, but kind of I think two big areas of discussion at least. So I think we can pull it off. So we're in chapter 4, as I said, and I want to start in verse 4. We covered this last week, but it's sort of one continuous thought. So it'd be good to put this in our ear again. And before I read that, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, cause us to rejoice in you always, and again to rejoice. In all circumstances, teach us contentment, not through our own willpower or positivity, but through your strength coming to us through Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. So let's pause there and take this all together. Last week we finished with this first section talking about rejoicing and this incredible news that the Lord's nearness is not an occasion to be known as the church by our gentleness in light of God's nearness. And so that's quite a thing there. And this prayer then, which incorporates thanksgiving, this prayer promises that God will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And it's wonderful that our guardian is a peacemaker as opposed to a warrior. The guardianship is the comfort of God's presence, His grace in Jesus for us. So he gives this call to prayer with the promise attached, and then and he says finally, for not the first or the last time, but he says finally, and he goes into this list, things that are true, honorable, pleasing, just, pure, on, and then he says think about these things. And this is a really interesting paragraph. He's not only writing to the church, but he's writing to people who have their own philosophies of the day, one of which is Stoicism, one of which continues to this day in popularity. And in fact, there's a really renewed interest in Stoicism in our day and age. Ryan Holiday is a best-selling author. He has a wonderful book called The Obstacle is the Way, and he gives little profiles in history, examples of leaders and thinkers who found that the obstacle is actually the way to the good life. And then this author has all kinds of books where he's pulled together old Stoic writers like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus and others, and it's very popular. We're no strangers to all the various self-help books, everything from pop psychology to personality inventories to just pure inspiration to think better. You may have even noticed a trend in the last couple of years to have a swear word on the title of the book, and then to have like an asterisk or something covering it up. So how to be a badass is sort of the mild one that I could say today, but it can go from there into any colorful language you wish with an asterisk. That becomes kind of a new snarky form of self-help around mindset. There's all kinds of versions of how to engage in the life of the mind and how to wage war in the battle in the mind. And we all know this, and I hope we can discuss this a bit. The war in the mind is a huge thing. Craig Groeschel is a Christian pastor, a mega church pastor. His church actually created the Bible app on the Apple iTunes store. So if you've ever downloaded the YouVersion Bible app, it was kind of the first, and it's one of the most downloaded apps out there. Anyway, his new book is called Winning the War in Your Mind. And I just listened to a preview of that. He's not usually an author I read, but I listened to kind of his summary of the book. And it's familiar. The terrain is familiar. How in the world do we live with the thoughts of our minds, the stories we tell ourselves, the things we believe, and the things we're not quite sure if we believe, but we tell ourselves so. And then, of course, the lies, the messages that are given to us that we can either accept or reject, and all that kind of stuff. The mind is an incredible thing. And not only is the mind an incredible thing, but now that we are living here on the other side of the Enlightenment, centuries beyond humans allegedly taking back control of their world, defining everything through the human use of reason, saying, religion can give us some personal values and revelations and state some beliefs. However, we can understand the world through our mind alone. One of the things that came out of the Enlightenment was this idea of mind over matter. And you can set your mind to things. And if we can use our minds to solve problems, then we can overcome more and more problems of life in the body. And of course, we all give thanks for medical science and other related sciences that help us to use our mind to solve problems with our bodies, and on it goes. But for Paul and the Philippians and the people of the ancient world, there's not such a clean separation of the life of the mind and the activity of spiritual things, and there is not such a conception of a person as a buffered individual who thinks their thoughts and is cut off from the world, and is sort of in control of its engagement with the world. Rather, an ancient person knows we are porous, as in like the porousness of the skin. We have many holes in our lives, and we are living in a world of powers and forces and spiritual realities that are unseen but are nevertheless everywhere, and always present. So when Paul tells us, and I'm going to open it up for discussion soon, this is kind of my opening salvo, when Paul tells us to think on all these things, he's not speaking to 21st century people who are used to thinking on all these things as if our brain could just sort of operate outside of the world, but he is actually continuing his letter long theme about Paul having the mind of Christ that became one of us to the point of death and is now exalted, and this mind that is in humility seeking the interests of others. That this kind of mindfulness is what Paul is getting after, and that is a far cry from individualism, and it's a far cry even from a stoic resignation to whatever happens, right? Stuff happens, but in fact he is giving a life that is shaped by the mind of Christ and the peace of God that passes all understanding, in informing our life as we find it. So let me pause, see how any of that's hitting or how you respond to that.
The first thing I think of is he does a preacher, because he says in conclusion or finally, and I'm going to close with this.
Yeah.
Typical ongoing sermon.
Yeah, there's a lot of false endings to sermons. Yep. What else are you hearing?
In verse 7 and verse 9, he uses the word peace.
Uh-huh.
I get the impression that it applies to our day as well as to the Stoicism days, because people are talking about their unrest of being closed in and isolated and that kind of thing. And it is really an emotional, mental issue. I'm hearing it over and over on news reports and special documentaries. And now there's even a WHO study on COVID, post-COVID, or rather COVID anxiety.
Yeah.
But this is a strange combination of words, a peace that passes understanding. And I think it relates to things like we usually get peace at the end of a project. I mean, I was watching the Mars landing of the rover and the tension in that room until the touchdown. And then there was this big celebration, but I think that was a sense of peace. And they got peace after, but he's talking about getting the peace that comes after getting it at the front end.
Yeah.
And that allows us to walk through issues of anxiety and isolation and struggle and difficulties, hard times, knowing going into it that at the other end we're going to have that peace. We get it here and we walk through it. That's walking through the valley of shadow of death with that peace.
That's
It's
great.
a strange combination of words to use peace beyond understanding. How do you do that?
Right. Yeah, we want peace from understanding. Like, help me understand why this is happening, or help me understand that everything's okay. It's like that's different. That's not peace. It's kind of like when Paul says, who hopes for what is seen? Hope that is seen is not hope. Who hopes for, who understands peace, because when you have peace, like, you're past understanding, like you have it.
So that's the God of peace he's talking about in 9.
Yeah.
But he tells us how in verse 6, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, with trust, with gratitude, with relationship, knowing.
Yeah. The God of peace produces a people whose gentleness is evident to all. And preaching in a spirit of anxiety will gain a following. It'll sell a lot of books too, especially if it's the anxiety that leaves us to continue the story, so it can stir up enough anxiety that you then figure out what you're going to do about it. And it never ends. I mean, the losses do this and it's never finished. You can build a church quicker through anxiety and whatever the opposite of gentleness is. And we have a God of peace.
Robinson.
That's 2 weeks in a row, Judy.
I want to link to something you said there, Kathy.
Yes.
That practice of prayer, of course, and I don't mean to set it aside, but it's taught. And I'm always a very deep person of practice because I'm the school teacher, and not just the school teacher. Taught the most disabled and worked with those who need it really broken down. I mean, into not just letter sounds like I used to teach kindergarten, but actually how to shape your lips and, the actual work of that. And so, because was such an influence in my mind, after the years when I was then in the administrative role, there's a lot about administrator that's not peaceful, especially in the middle of the night for me, when you would wake and you'd be dealing with big things, and often they were sad or tragic, how are we going to serve this young man who was hurt in this car wreck, those kinds of things. And that verse, verse 8, I got it for Christmas again from my sister, was one that when I would wake up at night, my mother had taught me when I was real little, it was kind of a way to pray, but not really. She had said, no, Mary, just think nothing, nothing, nothing. It was, don't stop asking for water, stop asking for anything, just nothing. It's time to sleep. Well, when I would wake in the night thinking nothing, when you're in your 40s, is not easy. And so I would think, I know what I would do. I'm going to think about whatever's true about this situation. And I would list what is true, what is honorable, what is just here, what could possibly be pure about this. And you could get to them. I mean, you really could. If I would just think, you know what, I'm going to find something lovely
Yes.
about this child's the seizures that have gotten triggered, that have gotten so bad, that the classroom is being disrupted. And you could find things, you could, if you go, what is lovely about this? And you could honestly, by looking deeper into the hearts of either the people there or the way someone had constructed the environment or whatever it was, you could find the loveliness. But it was an exercise in the middle of the night. But what it did is it shifted me from my mind, which was, what can I do? How do I move? What to Christ's mind in my mind. That's at least how I interpreted that verse at that time. Was, okay, I'm going to focus now on what is honorable about this and just spend time there. So that's just a practical step-by-step thing that I've done. I've gone beyond that, and I don't mean that in a light way. I could tell you the way I've activated this week that is kind of bizarre now, but when you've been home this long, Jerry, you find entertainment, and hey, the mind is entertaining.
Well,
Especially when we're focusing.
well, and you think like, we've already talked about the COVID stress or anxiety, but if you do anything for a year, I mean, we're in a laboratory right now. What happens if you are alone, or not alone, but what happens if you're home for a year? Give or take all the various other people who are not alone or not home all day. And so you see people coming out of this better, worse, nothing, like there's just, whatever you do, sometimes you see people, you haven't seen them all year and they seem angrier than you've ever seen them. Or you see somebody and they're like, they look different. And you're like, what have you been doing on pandemic? It's like, we all come out of the lab, like squinting in the sunlight and when we see each other. And I like, Mary, when you bring up educating kids with special needs, what Paul is giving us is not a platitude that's sort of like, well, pray and God will give you peace, like as if it's just magic, but he's actually giving us a discipline, which is think about these things, all these things, think. And he's not just saying think like put it on a billboard or hang it on your wall like a mantra, although that would be fine. But he's saying, and really the word think on these things, it's the word logizomai, it's logic, it's calculate these things, ponder these things, shake these things around and see what comes together. So it's again, not just a sort of take my, you're a baptized child of God, put it on the wall, and then that's that, the rest will work itself out. But it's really a call to constantly be meditating upon these things.
In a meditative practice, I hinted at this, but maybe this is good an audience for it. I'm doing I experiment all the time with things, and I've been doing a lot of it.
Mary, you're cutting out.
Is it? Yeah.
Sure, that's the word, but well, I know with some, so I,
I don't know if that's my internet as the host or if that's her internet.
It says on mine that her internet is low. Her bandwidth is low.
Okay. Yeah, and I can hear Jerry, I could hear you just fine. So I think it's on her end. I was worried about my internet today because my wife is working from home now and needs the internet. So I didn't know how we would play together, but
Oh,
all right. I'm gonna, yeah, she's totally frozen now. Let's see. Cutting. All right. Well,
I was.
go ahead, Sandy.
Well, I was just thinking about, and maybe it's just me, but when I read all these things that are positive that we're supposed to do, I react better to that than hearing a bunch of don't do this and don't do that and don't do something else. And Paul has done some negative things too, but I think people react better to things to do, positive things to do. So,
Unless
Yeah.
they've done something wrong.
right.
I was on a church staff, and the pastor wanted all the church staff. This was our church staff in Beijing. There was all these American pastors who were falling into sin and the revelations about that. So he passed around a pledge with Paul's list of lust and all the other negative things. And he says, I want everybody on the staff to sign so that our church elders know that this is where our church staff is at. And I refused to sign it. I said, I haven't violated that, so I don't have to do that. And then I quoted this passage in Philippians, and I said, you give me that, and I'll sign that as a pledge of my ministry and what my object. I didn't get rehired. It's very Calvinist.
Yeah. Yeah. Fruit inspectors. Or as Paul tells the Galatians.
That's a
Paul
great
tells the
description.
Yeah. Well, I picked that up because I'm in a tribe of Lutherans that sometimes get criticized for being too big on the gospel. But yeah, fruit inspectors. Paul talks about the Galatians, the people who came to spy on their freedom. And so those are the fruit inspectors, which there's no end to that. All you can really do is put together enough of a facade that the outside fruit looks good. But the fruit in the heart, you're never going to get assurance on your own on your own merits with that. If you think you're doing fine, just throw yourself into a global pandemic and then, think again.
I was in a Bible study this week in Luke, and we were looking at the prodigal son, and the emphasis most of the members kept, but the son had to make the decision to come back. And I said, when did the father decide to forgive the son? He was forgiven before he came back. They couldn't grasp that. It was something he had to do to get his father's forgiveness. And I said, but the father was forgiving even before he came back.
That's right.
That's hard to understand.
I mean, if you understand the shame of even asking for your inheritance while your dad's alive, and the father gives it, I mean, he's already forgiven him in the act of giving him his inheritance. He's already living in the grace of his father from the very start of the story, and he still takes off.
Yep.
So one commentary points out that during Paul's time, and even beforehand, even when Emperor Augustus was still alive, back in the days of Jesus's birth, there was a lot of emphasis on the Pax Romana, or the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And it wasn't just a phrase, but Pax was the goddess of peace. And so when Paul flips that phrase around, where at first he says, the peace of God, which passes understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. Then in verse 9, he says, the God of peace will be with you.
Yeah.
He's putting that toe to toe with the Roman goddess of Pax.
That's interesting.
But that was, the Pax Romana was strictly the concept of civilization and the Roman Empire imposing peace on people, as opposed to the war they had to get those people to peace.
Yeah, and the state always knows how to use religion to achieve its purposes. So let's put a little more emphasis on the goddess of peace now that we're in charge, and then on we go. It's I mean, this is what happens in our day and age too. I think Paul's call for us to think on these things. It reminds me of, and this is happening today too now, right? Like with all of our cultural unrest, people are trying to figure out which dystopic novel predicted things correctly. So you've always had the two big ones. You've had George Orwell's 1984, Big Brother, the official, state and media just lying. One day we're at war with this country, and the next week we were never at war with that country.
Balance.
The banning of books and so forth. And then the other predictive one would be Brave New World, where it's not so much Big Brother, it is that we've developed means of pleasure that we don't even really care what's really going on in the world because we're doing fine. And the question was always like, who's going to get it right? One commentator, Neil Postman, who wrote a lot in the past couple decades, Neil Postman's famous book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. He said, Postman writes, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books, and what Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book because no one would have wanted to read one. And then he kind of goes on from there and says, and I'll switch to the book titles. 1984 fears those who would deprive us of information, and Brave New World fears those who would give us so much we'd be reduced to passivity and egoism. 1984 fears the truth would be concealed. Brave New World fears the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. 1984 fears we'd become a captive culture. Brave New World fears we'd become a trivial culture, preoccupied with the feelies. And it just goes on like that. And alongside of that, now we have Paul's words, to consider the mind of Christ, to think on these true and pleasing and just things. And in thinking about these things, to receive a strength from the outside and a peace from God. That, it's sort of at that point, I have been crucified to the world and the world has been crucified to me, as is in Galatians 6. And you can say, well, whether you want to be Big Brother or the comforts of Netflix and everything I need at home, whatever route you want to take, world, it's fine, because I'm not thinking about either of these things. I'm thinking about the truth of Christ. Okay, let's press forward. The next section is from verse 10. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you've revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I'm referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share in my distress. So this is what I'm sorry, I was distracted. Andrea's just asked me if I could pick up Emmett from preschool. Whoops, she was supposed to be able to sneak away. This verse 13, of course, is a very famous confirmation Bible verse among many other uses of the verse. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's always nice to read it in context. What Paul is referring to at the beginning is basically that Epaphroditus has now come to him bearing a message from the Philippian church, and he's going to send him back. Paul has received, it seems, a financial gift, which the Philippians hadn't yet had the opportunity to put together, whether that's they didn't have the means or they didn't have the messenger. But he's received the gift, and he's trying to reassure them that the gift was not because he's living high on the hog, that he's content in all circumstances, but that it was a matter of rejoicing in the Lord that he was able to receive their gift. And just it says it was kind of them to share in his distress. Keeping in mind, Paul's imprisoned, and so to receive a gift is, I mean, that's how you eat if you're in prison. You have your people that make sure you get fed. And I would think that being content in all circumstances would be quite a thing over the last year that we've had together, don't you think?
And I think that's one of the testimonies of a Christian in our day and age.
Yeah. Okay, I apologize. Just a quick quick note. Yeah, Andrea is supposed to be able to take a break right now and pick up Emmett from preschool. She can't.
Oh, go.
So I can go, and if you guys want to discuss, or if you want to call it off and finish next week, we can go either way.
Yeah, let's do it next week
Yeah, let's-
together.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
We can get Mary back next week, and then Roger and Patty are going to watch the video, but they weren't able to make it with us live. So let's do that. Let's finish Philippians together next week. I appreciate your flexibility.
Okay,
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
bye.